Chapter 20 introduces the next. The passengers were landing from the packet on the pier at Calais. A low-lying place and a low-spirited place Calais was, with the tide ebbing out towards low water mark. There had been no more water on the bar than had sufficed to float the packet in, and now the bar itself, with a shallow break of sea over it, looked like a lazy marine monster had just risen to the surface, whose form was indistinctly shown as it lay asleep. The Meager Lighthouse, all in white, haunting the seaboard as if it were the ghost of an edifice that had once had colour and rotundity, dropped melancholy tears after its late buffeting by the waves. The long rows of gaunt black piles, slimy and wet and weather-worn, with funeral garlands of seaweed twisted about them by the late tide, might have represented an unsightly marine cemetery. Every wave-dashed, storm-beaten object was so low and so little under the broad grey sky, in the noise of the wind and sea, and before the curling lines of surf making at it ferociously, that the wonder was there was any Calais left, and that its low gates and low wall and low roofs and low ditches and low sandhills and low ramparts and flat streets had not yielded long ago to the undermining and besieging sea, like the fortifications children make on the sea-shore. After slipping among oozy piles and planks, stumbling up wet steps, and encountering many salt difficulties, the passengers entered on their comfortless peregrination along the pier, where all the French vagabonds and English outlaws in the town, half the population, attended to prevent their recovery from bewilderment. After being minutely inspected by all the English, and claimed and reclaimed and counterclaimed as prizes by all the French in a hand-to-hand scuffle 3/4 of a mile long, they were at last free to enter the streets, and to make off in their various directions, hotly pursued. Clennam, harassed by more anxieties than one, was among this devoted band. Having rescued the most defenceless of his compatriots from situations of great extremity, he now went his way alone, or as nearly alone as he could be, with a native gentleman in a suit of grease and a cap of the same material, giving chase at a distance of some 50 yards, and continually calling after him, I say, you, sir, I say, nice hotel." Even this hospitable person, however, was left behind at last, and Clennam pursued his way unmolested. There was a tranquil air in the town after the turbulence of the channel and the beach, and its dullness in that comparison was agreeable. He met new groups of his countrymen who had all a straggling air of having at one time overblown themselves, like certain uncomfortable kinds of flowers, and of being now mere weeds. They had all an air, too, of lounging out of a limited round, day after day, which strongly reminded him of the Marshalsea. But, taking no further note of them than was sufficient to give birth to the reflection, he sought out a certain street and number which he kept in his mind. "So Pank said," he murmured to himself as he stopped before a dull house answering to the address. "I suppose his information to be correct, and his discovery among Mr. Casby's loose papers indisputable, but without it I should hardly have supposed this to be a likely place. A dead sort of house, with a dead wall over the way and a dead gateway at the side, where a pendant bell handle produced 2 dead tinkles, and a knocker produced a dead, flat, surface tapping that seemed not to have depth enough in it to penetrate even the cracked door. However, the door jarred open on a dead sort of spring, and he closed it behind him as he entered a dull yard, soon brought to a close by another dead wall, where an attempt had been made to train some creeping shrubs which were dead, and to make a little fountain in a grotto which was dry, and to decorate that with a little statue which was gone. The entry to the house was on the left, and it was garnished, as the outer gateway was, with 2 printed bills in French and English, announcing furnished apartments to let, with immediate possession. A strong, cheerful peasant woman, all stocking, petticoat, white cap, and earring, stood here in a dark doorway, and said with a pleasant show of teeth, "I say, sire, who?" Clennam, replying in French, said the English lady. He wished to see the English lady. "Enter then and ascend, if you please," returned the peasant woman in French likewise. He did both, and followed her up a dark bare staircase to a back room on the first floor. Hence there was a gloomy view of the yard that was dull, and of the shrubs that were dead, and of the fountain that was dry, and of the pedestal of the statue that was gone. "Monsieur Blondois," said Clennam. "With pleasure, monsieur." Thereupon the woman withdrew and left him to look at the room. It was the pattern of room always to be found in such a house. Cool, dull, and dark. Waxed floor very slippery. A room not large enough to skate in, nor adapted to the easy pursuit of any other occupation. Red and white curtained windows, little straw mat, little round table with a tumultuous assemblage of legs underneath, clumsy, rush-bottomed chairs, two great red velvet armchairs affording plenty of space to be uncomfortable in, bureau, chimney-glass in several pieces pretending to be in one piece, pair of gaudy vases of very artificial flowers, between them a Greek warrior with his helmet off, sacrificing a clock to the genius of France. After some pause, a door of communication with another room was opened, and a lady entered. She manifested great surprise on seeing Clennam, and her glance went round the room in search of someone else. "Pardon me, Miss Wade, I am alone." "It was not your name that was brought to me." "No, I know that. Excuse me, I have already had experience that my name does not predispose you to an interview, and I ventured to mention the name of one I am in search of." "Pray," she returned, motioning him to a chair so coldly that he remained standing. "What name was it that you gave?" "I mentioned the name of Blondois." "Blondois? A name you are acquainted with?" "It is strange," she said, frowning, "that you should still press an undesired interest in me, and my acquaintance in me and my affairs, Mr. Clennam. I don't know what you mean." "Pardon me, you know the name?" "What can you have to do with the name? What can I have to do with the name? What can you have to do with my knowing or not knowing any name? I know many names, and I have forgotten many more. This may be in the one class, or it may be in the other, or I may never have heard it. I am acquainted with no reason for examining myself, or for being examined about it." "If you will allow me," said Clennam, "I will tell you my reason for pressing the subject. I admit that I do press it, and I must beg you to forgive me if I do so very earnestly. The reason is all mine. I do not insinuate that it is in any way yours." "Well, sir?" she returned, repeating a little less haughtily than before her former invitation to him to be seated, to which she now deferred as she seated herself. "I am at least glad to know that this is not another bondswoman of some friend of yours who is bereft of free choice, and whom I have spirited away. I will hear your reason, if you please." "First, to identify the person of whom we speak," said Clennam, "let me observe that it is the person you met in London some time back. You will remember meeting him near the river, in the Adelphi?" "You mix yourself most unaccountably with my business," she replied, looking full at him with stern displeasure. "How do you know that?" "I entreat you not to take it ill. By mere accident." "What accident?" "Solely the accident of coming upon you in the street and seeing the meeting." "Do you speak of yourself or of someone else?" "Of myself I saw it." "To be sure it was in the open street," she observed, after a few moments of less and less angry reflection. 50 people might have seen it. It would have signified nothing if they had. Nor do I make my having seen it of any moment, nor, otherwise than as an explanation of my coming here, do I connect my visit with it, or the favour that I have to ask." "Oh, you have to ask a favour? It occurred to me," and the handsome face looked bitterly at him, "that your manner was softened, Mr. Clennam." He was content to protest against this by a slight action without contesting it in words. He then referred to Blondois's disappearance, of which it was probable she had heard. However probable it was to him, she had heard of no such thing. Let him look around him, she said, and judge for himself what general intelligence was likely to reach the ears of a woman who had been shut up there while it was rife, devouring her own heart. When she had uttered this denial, which he believed to be true, she asked him what he meant by disappearance. That led to his narrating the circumstances in detail, and expressing something of his anxiety to discover what had really become of the man, and to repel the dark suspicions that clouded about his mother's house. She heard him with evident surprise, and with more marks of suppressed interest than he had seen in her. Still they did not overcome her distant, proud, and self-secluded manner. When he had finished, she said nothing but these words. "You have not yet told me, sir, what I have to do with it, or what the favour is. Will you be so good as to come to that?" "I assume," said Arthur, persevering in his endeavour to soften her scornful demeanour, "that being in communication, may I say confidential communication, with this person—" "You may say, of course, whatever you like," she remarked, "but I do not subscribe to your assumptions, Mr. Clennam, or to anyone's." "That being at least in personal communication with him," said Clennam, changing the form of his position in the hope of making it unobjectionable, "you can tell me something of his antecedents, pursuits, habits, usual place of residence, can give me some little clue by which to seek him out in the likeliest manner, and either produce him or establish what has become of him. This is the favour I ask, and I ask it in a distress of mind for which I hope you will feel some consideration. If you should have any reason for imposing conditions upon me, I will respect it without asking what it is." "You chanced to see me in the street with the man," she observed, after being, to his mortification, evidently more occupied with her own reflections on the matter than with his appeal. "Then you knew the man before?" "Not before, afterwards. I never saw him before, but I saw him again on this very night of his disappearance, in my mother's room. In fact, I left him there. You will read in this paper all that is known of him." He handed her one of the printed bills, which she read with a steady and attentive face. "This is more than I knew of him," she said, giving it back. Clennam's looks expressed his heavy disappointment, perhaps his incredulity, for she added in the same unsympathetic tone, "You don't believe it. Still, it is so. As to personal communication, it seems that there was personal communication between him and your mother, and yet you say you believe her declaration that she knows no more of him." A sufficiently expressive hint of suspicion was conveyed in these words, and in the smile by which they were accompanied, to bring the blood into Clennam's cheeks. "Come, sir," she said, with a cruel pleasure in repeating the stab, "I will be as open with you as you can desire. I will confess that if I cared for my credit, which I do not, or had a good name to preserve, which I have not, for I am utterly indifferent to its being considered good or bad, I shall regard myself as heavily compromised by having had anything to do with this fellow. Yet he never passed in at my door, never sat in colloquy with me until midnight." She took her revenge for her old grudge in thus turning his subject against him. Hers was not the nature to spare him, and she had no compunction. "That he is a low, mercenary wretch, that I first saw him prowling about Italy, where I was not long ago, and that I hired him there as the suitable instrument of a purpose I happen to have, I have no objection to tell you. In short, it was worth my while, for my own pleasure, the gratification of a strong feeling, to pay a spy who would fetch and carry for money. I paid this creature, and I dare say that if I had wanted to make such a bargain, and if I could have paid him enough, and if he could have done it in the dark, free from all risk, he would have taken any life with as little scruple as he took my money. That, at least, is my opinion of him, and I see it is not very far removed from yours. Your mother's opinion of him, I am to assume, following your example of assuming this and that, was vastly different." My mother, let me remind you, said Clennam, was first brought into communications with him in the unlucky course of business. It appears to have been an unlucky course of business that the last brought her into communication with him, returned Miss Wade, and business hours on that occasion were late. You imply, said Arthur, smarting under these cool-handed thrusts of which he had deeply felt the force already, that there was something. Mr. Clennam, she composedly interrupted, recollect that I do not speak by implication about the man. He is, I say again, without disguise, a low mercenary wretch. I suppose such a creature goes where there is occasion for him. If I had not had occasion for him, you would not have seen him and me together. Wrung by her persistence in keeping that dark side of the case before him, of which there was a half-hidden shadow in his own breast, Clennam was silent. I have spoken of him as still living, she added, but he may have been put out of the way for anything I know. For anything I care, also. I have no further occasion for him. With a heavy sigh and a despondent air, Arthur Clennam slowly rose. She did not rise also, but said, having looked at him in the meanwhile with a fixed look of suspicion and lips angrily compressed, He was the chosen associate of your dear friend Mr. Gowan, was he not? Why don't you ask your dear friend to help you? The denial that he was a dear friend rose to Arthur's lips, but he repressed it, remembering his old struggles and resolutions, and said, Further than that he has never seen Blondois since Blondois set out for England, Mr. Gowan knows nothing additional about him. He was a chance acquaintance made abroad. A chance acquaintance made abroad, she repeated. Yes, your dear friend has need to divert himself with all the acquaintances he can make, seeing what a wife he has. I hate his wife, sir. The anger with which she said it, the more remarkable for being so much under her restraint, fixed Clennam's attention and kept him on the spot. It flashed out of her dark eyes as they regarded him, quivered in her nostrils, and fired the very breath she exhaled, but her face was otherwise composed into a disdainful serenity, and her attitude was as calmly and haughtily graceful as if she had been in a mood of complete indifference. All I will say is, Miss Wade, he remarked, that you can have received no provocation to a feeling which I believe you have no sharer. You may ask your dear friend if you choose, she returned, for his opinion upon that subject. I am scarcely on those intimate terms with my dear friend, said Arthur, in spite of his resolutions, that would render my approaching the subject very probable, Miss Wade. I hate him, she returned, worse than his wife, because I was once dupe enough and false enough to myself almost to love him. You have seen me, sir, only on commonplace occasions, when I dare say you have thought me a commonplace woman, a little more self-willed than the generality. You know what I mean by hating, if you know me no better than that. You can't know without knowing with what care I have studied myself and people about me. For this reason I have for some time inclined to tell you what my life has been, not to propitiate your opinion, for I set no value on it, but that you may comprehend, when you think of your dear friend and his dear wife, what I mean by hating. Shall I give you something I have written put by for your perusal, or shall I hold my hand? Arthur begged her to give it to him. She went to the bureau, unlocked it, and took from an inner drawer a few folded sheets of paper. Without any conciliation of him, scarcely addressing him, rather speaking as if she were speaking to her own looking-glass for the justification of her own stubbornness, she said as she gave them to him, Now you may know what I mean by hating. No more of that. Sir, whether you find me temporarily and cheaply lodging in an empty London house, or in a Calais apartment, you find Harriet with me. You may like to see her before you leave. Harriet, come in. She called Harriet again. The second call produced Harriet, once Tattycoram. Here is Mr. Clennam, said Miss Wade. Not come for you. He has given you up, I suppose you have by this time? Having no authority or influence, yes, assented Clennam. Not come in search of you, you see, but still seeking someone. He wants that Blondois man. With whom I saw you in the Strand in London, hinted Arthur. If you know anything of him, Harriet, except that he came from Venice, which we all know, tell it to Mr. Clennam freely. I know nothing more about him, said the girl. Are you satisfied? Miss Wade inquired of Arthur. He had no reason to disbelieve them, the girl's manner being so natural as to be almost convincing, if he had had any previous doubts. He replied, I must seek for intelligence elsewhere. He was not going in the same breath, but he had risen before the girl entered, and she evidently thought he was. She looked quickly at him and said, Are they well, sir? Who? She stopped herself in saying what would have been all of them, glanced at Miss Wade and said, Mr. and Mrs. Meagles. They were when I last heard of them. They are not at home, by the way. Let me ask you, is it true that you were seen there? Where? Where does anyone say I was seen? Returned the girl, sullenly casting down her eyes. Looking in at the garden gate of the cottage. No, said Miss Wade. She has never been near it. You are wrong, then, said the girl. I went down there the last time we were in London. I went one afternoon when you left me alone, and I did look in. You poor-spirited girl, returned Miss Wade, with infinite contempt. Does all our companionship, do all our conversations, do all your old complainings tell for so little as that? There was no harm in looking in at the gate for an instant, said the girl. I saw by the windows that the family were not there. Why should you go near the place? Because I wanted to see it, because I felt that I should like to look at it again. As each of the two handsome faces looked at each other, Clennam felt how each of the two natures must be constantly tearing the other to pieces. Oh, said Miss Wade, coldly subduing and removing her glance, if you had any desire to see the place where you led the life from which I rescued you, because you had found out what it was, that is another thing. But is that your truth to me? Is that your fidelity to me? Is that the common cause I make with you? You are not worth the confidence I have placed in you. You are not worth the favour I have shown you. You are no higher than a spaniel, and had better go back to the people who did worse than whip you. If you speak so of them with anyone else by to hear, you'll provoke me to take their part, said the girl. Go back to them, Miss Wade retorted. Go back to them. You know very well, retorted Harriet in her turn, that I won't go back to them. You know very well that I have thrown them off, and never can, never shall, never will go back to them. Let them alone, then, Miss Wade. You prefer their plenty to your less fat living here, she rejoined. You exalt them and slight me. What else should I have expected? I ought to have known it. It's not so, said the girl, flushing high, and you don't say what you mean. I know what you mean. You are approaching me underhanded, with having nobody but you to look to. And because I have nobody but you to look to, you think you are to make me do or not do everything you please, and are to put any affront upon me. You're as bad as they were, every bit. But I will not be quite tamed and made submissive. I will say again that I went to look at the house because I had often thought that I should like to see it once more. I will ask again how they are, because I once again liked them and at times thought they were kind to me. Hereupon Clennam said that he was sure they would still receive her kindly if she would ever desire to return. Never, said the girl passionately. I shall never do that. Nobody knows that better than Miss Wade, though she taunts me because she has made me her dependent. And I know I am so, and I know she is overjoyed when she can bring it to my mind. A good pretence, said Miss Wade, with no less anger, haughtiness, and bitterness, but too threadbare to cover what I plainly see in this. My poverty will not bear competition with their money. Better go back at once. Better go back at once and have done with it. Arthur Clennam looked at them, standing a little distance asunder in the dull, confined room, each proudly cherishing her own anger, each with a fixed determination torturing her own breast and torturing the others. He said a word or two of leave-taking, but Miss Wade barely inclined her head, and Harriet, with the assumed humiliation of an abject dependent and serf, but not without defiance for all that, made as if she were too low to notice or to be noticed. He came down the dark, winding stairs into the yard with an increased sense upon him of the gloom of the wall that was dead, and of the shrubs that were dead, and of the fountain that was dry, and of the statue that was gone. Pondering much on what he had seen and heard in that house, as well as on the failure of all his efforts to trace the suspicious character who was lost, he returned to London and to England by the packet that had taken him over. On the way, he unfolded the sheets of paper and read in them what is reproduced in the next chapter. Chapter 21. The History of a Self-Tormentor. I have the misfortune of not being a fool. From a very early age I have detected what those about me thought they hid from me. If I could have been habitually imposed upon, instead of habitually discerning the truth, I might have lived as smoothly as most fools do. My childhood was passed with a grandmother, that is to say, with a lady who represented that relative to me, and who took that title on herself. She had no claim to it, but I, being to that extent a little fool, had no suspicion of her. She had some children of her own family in her house, and some children of other people. All girls, 10 in number, including me. We all lived together and were educated together. I must have been about 12 years old when I began to see how determinately those girls patronized me. I was told I was an orphan. There was no other orphan among us, and I perceived, here was the first disadvantage of not being a fool, that they conciliated me in an insolent pity and in a sense of superiority. I did not set this down as a discovery rashly. I tried them often. I could hardly make them quarrel with me. When I succeeded with any of them, they were sure to come after an hour or two and begin a reconciliation. I tried them over and over again, and I never knew them wait for me to begin. They were always forgiving me in their vanity and condescension. Little images of grown people. One of them was my chosen friend. I loved that stupid mite in a passionate way that she could no more deserve than I can remember without feeling ashamed of, though I was but a child. She had what they called an amiable temper, an affectionate temper. She could distribute and did distribute pretty looks and smiles to everyone among them. I believe there was not a soul in the place except myself who knew that she did it purposely to wound and gall me. Nevertheless, I so loved that unworthy girl that my life was made stormy by my fondness for her. I was constantly lectured and disgraced for what was called trying her, in other words, charging her with her little perfidy and throwing her into tears by showing her that I read her heart. However, I loved her faithfully, and one time I went home with her for the holidays. She was worse at home than she had been at school. She had a crowd of cousins and acquaintances, and we had dances at her house and went out to dances at other houses, and, both at home and out, she tormented my love beyond endurance. Her plan was to make them all fond of her, and so drive me wild with jealousy. To be familiar and endearing with them all, and so make me mad with envying them. When we were left alone in our bedroom at night, I would reproach her with my perfect knowledge of her baseness, and then she would cry and say I was cruel, and then I would hold her in my arms till morning, loving her as much as ever, and often feeling as if, rather than suffer too, I could so hold her in my arms and plunge to the bottom of a river, where I would still hold her after we were both dead. It came to an end, and I was relieved. In the family there was an aunt who was not fond of me. I doubt if any of the family liked me much, but I never wanted them to like me, being altogether bound up in the one girl. The aunt was a young woman, and she had a serious way with her eyes of watching me. She was an audacious woman, and openly looked compassionately at me. After one of the nights that I have spoken of, I came down into a greenhouse before breakfast. Charlotte, the name of my false young friend, had gone down before me, and I heard this aunt speaking to her about me as I entered. I stopped where I was, among the leaves, and listened. The aunt said, "Charlotte, Miss Wade is wearing you to death, and this must not continue." I repeat the very words I heard. Now what did she answer? Did she say, "It is I who am wearing her to death, I who am keeping her on a rack and am the executioner? Yet she tells me every night that she loves me devotedly, though she knows what I make her undergo." No, my first memorable experience was true to what I knew her to be and to all my experience. She began sobbing and weeping to secure the aunt's sympathy to herself, and said, "Dear aunt, she has an unhappy temper. Other girls at school, besides I, try hard to make it better. We all try hard." Upon that the aunt fondled her, as if she had said something noble instead of despicable and false, and kept up the infamous pretence by replying, "But there are reasonable limits, my dear love, to everything, and I see that this poor miserable girl causes you more constant and useless distress than even so good an effort justifies." The poor miserable girl came out of her concealment, as you may be prepared to hear, and said, "Send me home." I never said another word to either of them, or to any of them, but "Send me home, or I will walk home alone night and day." When I got home, I told my supposed grandmother that, unless I was sent away to finish my education somewhere else before that girl came back, or before any one of them came back, I would burn my sight away by throwing myself into the fire, rather than I would endure to look at their plotting faces. I went among young women next, and I found them no better. Fair words and fair pretences, but I penetrated below those assertions of themselves and depreciations of me, and they were no better. Before I left them, I learned that I had no grandmother and no recognized relation. I carried the light of that information both into my past and into my future. It showed me many new occasions on which people triumphed over me, when they made a pretense of treating me with consideration or doing me a service. A man of business had a small property in trust for me. I was to be a governess. I became a governess, and went into the family of a poor nobleman, where there were 2 daughters, little children, but the parents wished them to grow up, if possible, under one instructress. The mother was young and pretty. From the first she made a show of behaving to me with great delicacy. I kept my resentment to myself, but I knew very well that it was her way of petting the knowledge that she was my mistress, and might have behaved differently to her servant if it had been her fancy. I say I did not resent her, nor did I, but I showed her, by not gratifying her, that I understood her. When she pressed me to take wine, I took water. If there happened to be anything choice at table, she always sent it to me, but I always declined it, and ate of the rejected dishes. These disappointments of her patronage were a sharp retort, and made me feel independent. I liked the children. They were timid, but on the whole disposed to attach themselves to me. There was a nurse, however, in the house, a rosy-faced woman always making an obtrusive pretence of being gay and good-humoured, who had nursed them both, and who had secured their affections before I saw them. I could almost have settled down to my fate, but for this woman. Her artful devices for keeping herself before the children in constant competition with me might have blinded many in my place, but I saw through them from the first. On the pretext of arranging my rooms and waiting on me and taking care of my wardrobe, all of which she did busily, she was never absent. The most crafty of her many subtleties was her feint of seeking to make the children fonder of me. She would lead them to me and coax them to me. "Come to good Miss Wade. Come to dear Miss Wade. Come to pretty Miss Wade. She loves you very much. Miss Wade is a clever lady who has read heaps of books and can tell you far better and more interesting stories than I know. Come and hear Miss Wade." How could I engage their attentions when my heart was burning against these ignorant designs? How could I wonder when I saw their innocent faces shrinking away and their arms twining round her neck instead of mine? Then she would look up at me, shaking their curls from her face, and say, "They'll come round soon, Miss Wade. They're very simple and loving, ma'am. Don't be at all cast down about it, ma'am," exulting over me. There was another thing the woman did. At times, when she saw that she had safely plunged me into a black despondent brooding by these means, she would call the attention of the children to it, and would show them the difference between herself and me. "Hush! Poor Miss Wade is not well. Don't make a noise, my dears. Her head aches. Come and comfort her. Come and ask her if she is better. Come and ask her to lie down. I hope you have nothing on your mind, ma'am. Don't take on, ma'am, and be sorry." It became intolerable. Her ladyship, my mistress, coming in one day when I was alone, and at the height of feeling that I could support it no longer, I told her I must go. I could not bear the presence of that woman Dawes. "Miss Wade, poor Dawes is devoted to you, would do anything for you." I knew beforehand she would say so. I was quite prepared for it. I only answered it was not for me to contradict my mistress. I must go. "I hope, Miss Wade," she returned, instantly assuming the tone of superiority she had always so thinly concealed, "that nothing I have ever said or done since we have been together has justified your use of that disagreeable word." "Mistress, it must have been wholly inadvertent on my part. Pray tell me what it is." I replied that I had no complaint to make, either of my mistress or to my mistress, but I must go. She hesitated a moment, and then sat down beside me and laid her hand on mine, as if that honour would obliterate any remembrance. "Miss Wade, I fear you are unhappy through causes over which I have no influence." I smiled, thinking of the experience the word awakened, and said, "I have an unhappy temper, I suppose." "I did not say that. It is an easy way of accounting for anything," said I. "It may be, but I did not say so. What I wish to approach is something very different. My husband and I have exchanged some remarks upon the subject, when we have observed with pain that you have not been easy with us." "Easy? Oh, you are such great people, my lady," said I. "I am unfortunate in using a word which may convey a meaning, and evidently does, quite opposite to my intention." She had not expected my reply, and it shamed her. "I only mean not happy with us. It is a difficult topic to enter on, but from one young woman to another, perhaps, in short, we have been apprehensive that you may allow some family circumstances, of which no one can be more innocent than yourself, to prey upon your spirits. If so, let us entreat you not to make them a cause of grief. My husband himself, as is well known, formerly had a very dear sister who was not in law his sister, but who was universally beloved and respected. I saw directly that they had taken me in for the sake of the dead woman, whoever she was, and to have that boast of me an advantage of me. I saw, in the nurse's knowledge of it, an encouragement to goad me as she had done, and I saw, in the children's shrinking away, a vague impression that I was not like other people. I left the house that night. After one or two short and very similar experiences, which are not to be the present purpose, I entered another family where I had but one pupil, a girl of 15, who was the only daughter. The parents here were elderly people, people of station and rich. A nephew whom they had brought up was a frequent visitor at the house, among many other visitors, and he began to pay me attention. I was resolute in repulsing him, for I had determined when I went there that no one should pity me or condescend to me. But he wrote me a letter. It led to our being engaged to be married. He was a year younger than I, and young-looking even when that allowance was made. He was on absence from India, where he had a post that was soon to grow into a very good one. In 6 months we were to be married, and were to go to India. I was to stay in the house, and was to be married from the house. Nobody objected to any part of the plan. I cannot avoid saying he admired me, but if I could, I would. Vanity has nothing to do with the declaration, for his admiration worried me. He took no pains to hide it. and caused me to feel among the rich people as if he had bought me for my looks, and made a show of his purchase to justify himself. They appraised me in their own minds, I saw, and were curious to ascertain what my full value was. I resolved that they should not know. I was immovable and silent before them, and would have suffered any one of them to kill me sooner than I would have laid myself out to bespeak their approval. He told me I did not do myself justice. I told him I did, and it was because I did, and meant to do so to the last, that I would not stoop to propitiate any of them. He was concerned and even shocked when I added that I wished he would not parade his attachment before them, but he said he would sacrifice even the honest impulses of his affection to my peace. Under that pretence he began to retort upon me. By the hour together he would keep at a distance from me, talking to anyone rather than to me. I have sat alone and unnoticed half an evening while he conversed with his young cousin, my pupil. I have seen all the while in people's eyes that they thought the two looked nearer on an equality than he and I. I have sat divining their thoughts until I have felt that his younger appearance made me ridiculous, and have raged against myself for ever loving him. For I did love him once. Undeserving as he was, and little as he thought of all these agonies that it cost me, agonies which should have made him wholly and gratefully mine to his life's end, I loved him. I bore with his cousins praising him to my face, and with her pretending to think that it pleased me, but full well knowing that it rankled in my breast for his sake. While I have sat in his presence recalling all my slights and wrongs, and deliberating whether I should not fly from the house at once and never see him again, I have loved him. His aunt, my mistress, you will please to remember, deliberately, wilfully added to my trials and vexations. It was her delight to expatiate on the style in which we were to live in India, and on the establishment we should keep, and the company we should entertain when he got his advancement. My pride rose against this barefaced way of pointing out the contrast my married life was to present to my then dependent and inferior position. I suppressed my indignation, but I showed her that her intention was not lost upon me, and I repaid her annoyance by affecting humility. What she described would surely be a great deal too much honour for me, I would tell her. I was afraid I might not be able to support so great a change. Think of a mere governess, her daughter's governess, coming to that high distinction. It made her uneasy, and made them all uneasy, when I answered in this way. They knew that I fully understood her. It was at the time when my troubles were at their highest, and when I was most incensed against my lover for his ingratitude in caring as little as he did for the innumerable distresses and mortifications I underwent on his account, that your dear friend, Mr. Gowan, appeared at the house. He had been intimate there for a long time, but had been abroad. He understood the state of things at a glance, and he understood me. He was the first person I had ever seen in my life who had understood me. He was not in the house 3 times before I knew that he accompanied every moment of my mind. In his coldly easy way with all of them, and with me, and with the whole subject, I saw it clearly. In his light protestations of admiration of my future husband, in his enthusiasm regarding our engagement and our prospects, in his hopeful congratulations on our future wealth, and his despondent references to his own poverty, all equally hollow and jesting and full of mockery, I saw it clearly. He made me feel more and more resentful and more contemptible by always presenting to me everything that surrounded me with some new hateful light upon it, while he pretended to exhibit in it its best aspect for my admiration and his own. He was like the dressed-up Death in the Dutch series. Whatever figure he took upon his arm, whether it was youth or age, beauty or ugliness, whether he danced with it, sang with it, played with it, or prayed with it, he made it ghastly. You will understand, then, that when your dear friend complimented me, he really condoled with me, that when he soothed me under my vexations, he laid bare every smarting wound I had, that when he declared my faithful swain to be the most loving young fellow in the world, with the tenderest heart that ever beat, He touched my old misgiving that I was made ridiculous. These were not great services, you may say. They were acceptable to me because they echoed my own mind and confirmed my own knowledge. I soon began to like the society of your dear friend better than any other. When I perceived, which I did almost as soon, that jealousy was growing out of this, I liked this society still better. Had I not been subject to jealousy, and were the endurances to be all mine? No, let him know what it was. I was delighted that he should know it. I was delighted that he should feel keenly, and I hoped he did. More than that, he was tame in comparison with Mr. Gowan, who knew how to address me on equal terms, and how to anatomize the wretched people around us. This went on, until the aunt, my mistress, took it upon herself to speak to me. It was scarcely worth alluding to. She knew I meant nothing, but she suggested from herself, knowing it was only necessary to suggest, that it might be better if I were a little less companionable with Mr. Gowan. I asked her how she could answer for what I meant. She could always answer, she replied, for my meaning nothing wrong. I thanked her, but said I would prefer to answer for myself and to myself. Her other servants would probably be grateful for good characters, but I wanted none. Other conversation followed, and induced me to ask her how she knew it was only necessary for her to make a suggestion to me to have it obeyed. Did she presume on my birth or on my hire? I was not bought, body and soul. She seemed to think that her distinguished nephew had gone into a slave market and purchased a wife. It would probably have come, sooner or later, to the end to which it did come, but she brought it to its issue at once. She told me, with assumed commiseration, that I had an unhappy temper. On this repetition of the old wicked injury, I withheld no longer, but exposed to her all I had known of her and seen in her, and all I had undergone within myself since I had occupied the despicable position of being engaged to her nephew. I told her that Mr. Gowan was the only relief I had had in my degradation, that I had borne it too long, and that I shook it off too late, but that I would see none of them more. And I never did. Your dear friend followed me to my retreat, and was very droll on the severance of the connection, though he was sorry, too, for the excellent people, in their way the best he had ever met, and deplored the necessity of breaking mere house-flies on the wheel. He protested before long, and far more truly than I supposed, that he was not worth acceptance by a woman of such endowment and such power of character, but, well, well. Your dear friend amused me and amused himself as long as it suited his inclinations, and then reminded me that we were both people of the world, that we both understood mankind, that we both knew there was no such thing as romance, that we were both prepared for going different ways to seek our fortunes like people of sense, and that we both foresaw that whenever we encountered one another again, we should meet as the best of friends on earth. So he said, and I did not contradict him. It was not very long before I found that he was courting his present wife, and that she had been taken away to be out of his reach. I hated her then, quite as much as I hate her now, and naturally, therefore, could desire nothing better than that she should marry him. But I was restlessly curious to look at her, so curious that I felt it to be one of the few sources of entertainment left to me. I travelled a little, travelled until I found myself in her society and in yours. Your dear friend, I think, was not known to you then, and had not given you any of those signal marks of his friendship which he has bestowed upon you. In that company I found a girl, in various circumstances, of whose position there was a singular likeness to my own, and in whose character I was interested and pleased to see much of the rising against swollen patronage and selfishness, calling themselves kindness, protection, benevolence, and other fine names, which I have described as inherent in my nature. I often heard it said, too, that she had an unhappy temper. Well, understanding what was meant by the convenient phrase, and wanting a companion with a knowledge of what I knew, I thought I would try to release the girl from her bondage and sense of injustice. I have no occasion to relate that I succeeded. We have been together ever since, sharing my small means. Chapter 22. Who passes by this road so late? Arthur Clennam had made his unavailing expedition to Calais in the midst of a great pressure of business. A certain barbaric power, with valuable possessions on the map of the world, had occasion for the services of one or two engineers, quick in invention and determined in execution. Practical men who could make the men and means their ingenuity perceived to be wanted out of the best of materials they could find at hand, and who were as bold and fertile in the adaptation of such materials to their purpose as in the conception of their purpose itself. This power, being a barbaric one, had no idea of stowing away a great national object in a circumlocution office, as strong wine is hidden from the light in a cellar until its fire and youth are gone, and the labourers who worked in the vineyard and pressed the grapes are dust. With characteristic ignorance, it acted on the most decided and energetic notions of how to do it, and never showed the least respect for, or gave any quarter to, the great political science, how not to do it. Indeed, it had a barbarous way of striking the latter art and mystery dead, in the person of any enlightened subject who practised it. Accordingly, the men who were wanted were sought out and found, which was in itself a most uncivilized and irregular way of proceeding. Being found, they were treated with great confidence and honour, which again showed dense political ignorance, and were invited to come at once and do what they had to do. In short, they were regarded as men who meant to do it, engaging with other men who meant it to be done. Daniel Deutsch was one of the chosen. There was no foreseeing at that time whether he would be absent months or years. The preparations for his departure and the conscientious arrangement for him of all the details and results of their joint business had necessitated labour within a short compass of time, which had occupied Clennam day and night. He had slipped across the water in his first leisure, and had slipped as quickly back again for his farewell interview with Deutsch. Him Arthur now showed, with pains and care, the state of their gains and losses, responsibilities and prospects. Daniel went through it all in his patient manner, and admired it all exceedingly. He audited the accounts as if they were a far more ingenious piece of mechanism than he had ever constructed, and afterwards stood looking at them, weighing his hat over his head by the brims, as if he were absorbed in the contemplation of some wonderful engine. "It's all beautiful, Clennam, in its regularity and order. Nothing can be plainer, nothing can be better." "I'm glad you approve, Deutsch. Now, as to the management of your capital while you are away, and as to the conversion of so much of it as the business may need from time to time." His partner stopped him. "As to that, and as to everything else of that kind, all rests with you. You will continue in all such matters to act for both of us, as you have done hitherto, and to lighten my mind of a load it is much relieved from." "Though, as I often tell you," returned Clennam, "you unreasonably depreciate your business qualities." "Perhaps so," said Deutsch, smiling, "and perhaps not. Anyhow, I have a calling that I have studied more than such matters, and that I am better fitted for. I have perfect confidence in my partner, and I am satisfied that he will do what is best. If I have a prejudice connected with money and money figures," continued Deutsch, laying that plastic workman's thumb of his on the lapel of his partner's coat, "it is against speculating. I don't think I have any other. I dare say I entertain that prejudice only because I have never given my mind fully to the subject." "But you shouldn't call it prejudice," said Clennam. "My dear Deutsch, it is the soundest sense." "I am glad you think so," returned Deutsch, with his grey eye looking kind and bright. "It so happens," said Clennam, "that just now, not half an hour before you came down, I was saying the same thing to Panks, who looked in here. We both agreed that to travel out of safe investments is one of the most dangerous, as it is one of the most common of those follies which often deserve the name of vices." "Panks?" said Doyce, tilting up his hat at the back and nodding with an air of confidence. Aye. That's a cautious fellow." "He is a very cautious fellow indeed," returned Arthur. "Quite a specimen of caution." They both appeared to derive a larger amount of satisfaction from the cautious character of Mr. Panks than was quite intelligible, judged by the surface of their conversation. "And now," said Daniel, looking at his watch, "as time and tide wait for no man, my trusty partner, and as I am ready for starting, bag and baggage at the gate below, let me say a last word. I want you to grant a request of mine." "Any request you make, except—" Clennam was quick with his exception, for his partner's face was quick in suggesting it, "except that I will abandon your invention." "That's the request, and you know it is," said Doyce. "I say no. Then I say positively no. Now that I have begun, I will have some definite reason, some responsible statement, something in the nature of a real answer from those people." "You will not," returned Doyce, shaking his head. "Take my word for it, you never will." "At least I'll try," said Clennam. "It will do me no harm to try." "I am not certain of that," rejoined Doyce, laying his hand persuasively on his shoulder. "It has done me harm, my friend. It has aged me, tired me, vexed me, disappointed me. It does no man any good to have his patience worn out and to think himself ill-used. I fancy even already that unavailing attendance on delays and evasion has made you something less elastic than you used to be." "Private anxieties may have done that for the moment," said Clennam, "but not official harrying. Not yet. I am not hurt yet." "Then you won't grant my request?" "Decidedly no," said Clennam. "I should be ashamed if I submitted to be so soon driven out of the field where a much older and a much more sensitively interested man contended with fortitude so long." As there was no moving him, Daniel Doyce returned the grasp of his hand and, casting a farewell look round the counting-house, went downstairs with him. Doyce was to go to Southampton to join the small staff of his fellow travellers, and a coach was at the gate, well furnished and packed, and ready to take him there. The workmen were at the gate to see him off and were mightily proud of him. "Good luck to you, Mr. Doyce," said one of the number. "Wherever you go, they'll find as they've got a man among 'em, a man as knows his tools and as his tools knows, a man as is willing and a man as is able, and if that's not a man, where is a man?" This oration from a gruff volunteer in the background, not previously suspected of any powers in that way, was received with 3 loud cheers, and the speaker became a distinguished character for ever afterwards. In the midst of the 3 loud cheers, Daniel gave them all a hearty "Goodbye, men," and the coach disappeared from sight as if the conclusion of the air had blown it out of Bleeding Heart Yard. Mr. Baptiste, as a grateful little fellow in a position of trust, was among the workmen, and had done as much towards the cheering as a mere foreigner could. In truth, no men on earth can cheer like Englishmen, who do so rally one another's blood and spirit when they cheer in earnest, that the stir is like the rush of their whole history, with all its standards waving at once, from Saxon Alfreds downwards. Mr. Baptiste had been in a manner whirled away before the onset, and was taking his breath in quite a scared condition when Clennam beckoned him to follow upstairs and return the books and papers to their places. In the lull consequent on the departure, in that first vacuity which ensues on every separation, foreshadowing the great separation that is always overhanging all mankind, Arthur stood at his desk looking dreamily out at a gleam of sun. But his liberated attention soon reverted to the theme that was foremost in his thoughts, and began, for the 100th time, to dwell upon every circumstance that had impressed itself upon his mind on the mysterious night when he had seen the man at his mother's. Again the man jostled him in the crooked street. Again he followed the man and lost him. Again he came upon the man in the courtyard looking at the house. Again he followed the man and stood beside him on the doorsteps. Who passes by this road so late, Compagnon de la Magdeleine? Who passes by this road so late, always gay? It was not the first time by many that he had recalled the song of the child's game, of which the fellow had hummed a verse while they stood side by side, but he was so unconscious of having repeated it audibly that he started to hear the next verse. Of all the knights 'tis flower, Compagnon de la Magdeleine, of all the king's knights 'tis the flower, always gay. Cavaletto had deferentially suggested the words and tune, supposing him to have stopped short for want of more. "Ah, you know the song, Cavaletto?" "By Bacchus, yes, sir. They all know it in France. I have heard it many times sung by the little children. The last time when I have heard," said Mr. Baptiste, formerly Cavaletto, who usually went back to his native construction of sentences when his memory went near home, "is from a sweet little voice very pretty, very innocent. Altro." "The last time I heard it," returned Arthur, "was in a voice quite the reverse of pretty and quite the reverse of innocent." He said it more to himself than to his companion, and added to himself, repeating the man's next words, "Death of my life, sir, it's my character to be impatient." "Eh?" cried Cavaletto, astounded, with all his colour gone in a moment. "What is the matter?" "Sir, you know where I have heard that song the last time." With his rapid native action, his hands made the outline of a high hook nose, pushed his eyes near together, dishevelled his hair, puffed out his upper lip to represent a thick moustache, and threw the heavy end of an ideal cloak over his shoulder. While doing this, with a swiftness incredible to one who has not watched an Italian peasant, he indicated a very remarkable and sinister smile. The whole change passed over him like a flash of light, and he stood in the same instant, pale and astonished, before his patron. "In the name of fate and wonder," said Clennam, "what do you mean?" "Do you know a man of the name of Blondois?" "No," said Mr. Baptiste, shaking his head. "You have just now described a man who was by when you heard that song, have you not?" "Yes," said Mr. Baptiste, nodding 50 times. "And was he not called Blondois?" "No," said Mr. Baptiste. "Altro, altro, altro, altro." He could not reject the name sufficiently, with his head and his right forefinger going at once. "Stay," cried Clennam, spreading out the handbill on his desk. "Was this the man? You can understand what I read aloud?" "Altogether perfectly. But look at it too. Come here and look over me while I read." Mr. Baptiste approached, followed every word with his quick eyes, saw and heard it all out with the greatest impatience, and then clapped his 2 hands flat upon the bill as if he had fiercely caught some noxious creature, and cried, looking eagerly at Clennam, "It is the man! Behold him!" "This is of far greater moment to me," said Clennam in great agitation, "than you can imagine. Tell me where you knew the man." Mr. Baptiste, releasing the paper very slowly and with much discomfiture, and drawing himself back 2 or 3 paces, and making as though he dusted his hands, returned, very much against his will, "At Marseilles. Marseilles." "What was he?" "A prisoner, and altro, I believe, yes, and—" Mr. Baptiste crept closer again to whisper it. "Assassin." Clennam fell back as if the word had struck him a blow. So terrible did it make his mother's communication with the man appear. Cavaletto dropped on one knee and implored him with a redundancy of gesticulation to hear what had brought himself into such foul company. He told, with perfect truth, how it had come of a little contraband trading, and how he had in time been released from prison, and how he had gone away from those antecedents. How, at the house of entertainment called the Break of Day at Chalons-on-the-Saône, he had been awakened in his bed at night by the same assassin, then assuming the name of Lanier, though his name had formerly been Rigaud. How the assassin had proposed that they should join their fortunes together, how he held the assassin in such dread and aversion that he had fled from him at daylight, and how he had ever since been haunted by the fear of seeing the assassin again and being claimed by him as an acquaintance. When he had related this, with an emphasis and poise on the word assassin, peculiarly belonging to his own language, and which did not serve to render it less terrible to Clennam, he suddenly sprang to his feet, pounced upon the bill again, and with a vehemence that would have been absolute madness in any man of northern origin, cried, "Behold the same assassin! Here he is!" In his passionate raptures, he at first forgot the fact that he had lately seen the assassin in London. On his remembering it, it suggested hope to Clennam that the recognition might be of later date than the night of the visit at his mother's. But Cavaletto was too exact and clear about time and place to leave any opening for doubt that it had preceded that occasion. "Listen," said Arthur very seriously. "This man, as we have read here, has wholly disappeared." "Of it I am well content," said Cavaletto, raising his eyes piously. "A thousand thanks to heaven, accursed assassin." "Not so," returned Clennam, "for until something more is heard of him, I can never know an hour's peace." "Enough, benefactor, that is quite another thing. A million of excuses." "Now, Cavaletto," said Clennam, gently turning him by the arm so that they looked into each other's eyes, "I am certain that for the little I have been able to do for you, you are the most sincerely grateful of men." "I swear it," cried the other. "I know it. If you could find this man, or discover what has become of him, or gain any later intelligence whatever of him, you would render me a service above any other service I could receive in the world, and would make me, with far greater reason, as grateful to you as you are to me." "I know not where to look," cried the little man, kissing Arthur's hand in a transport. "I know not where to begin. I know not where to go. But courage, enough. It matters not. I go, in this instant of time." "Not a word to any one but me, Cavaletto." "Altro!" cried Cavaletto, and was gone with speed.